Winter arrives slowly in Yosemite National Park. Snow gathers first along shaded ridges, then settles across the meadows and riverbanks, muting sound. The granite walls remain exposed longer than the valley floor, holding pale light even as temperatures fall below freezing. By mid-season, movement becomes rare. Roads close intermittently, campgrounds empty. The valley grows quiet in a way difficult to imagine during summer months. High above the trees, the face of El Capitan stands unchanged. Nearly vertical, its surface collects little snow, yet winter reshapes the experience of climbing it. Metal stiffens in the cold. Water freezes inside ropes and equipment. Small ledges that offer rest in warmer seasons become exposed platforms open to wind moving down from the higher peaks of the Sierra Nevada. Sound travels differently in winter air. A falling fragment of ice can be heard long after it disappears. Ravens circle without urgency. The Merced River continues beneath thin sheets of forming ice, its movement steady and unseen from above. Climbers have long been drawn here during colder months. Fewer visitors mean fewer interruptions. Routes feel isolated, almost detached from the world below. Progress slows, but the landscape offers clarity. Each action becomes deliberate, placing protection, securing anchors, conserving warmth. On certain days, clouds descend into the valley and remain there, obscuring distance. From the wall, the ground disappears entirely. The climber's world narrows to stone, rope, and weather. Above and below, visibility fades, leaving only granite and winter light. Winter ascents in Yosemite during the early 1980s were rarely casual undertakings. Those who attempted them usually belonged to a small community shaped by long seasons, on rock and extended time in remote terrain. By then, big wall climbing had matured into a disciplined practice built on method rather than improvisation. Equipment was heavier than in later decades, and progress depended on patience, technical systems, and endurance. The climbers involved in the winter rescue were not beginners. Contemporary incident summaries released through the national park service described them as experienced wall climbers familiar with multi-day ascents. They had previously climbed in Yosemite Valley during more stable seasons and understood the basic demands of hauling equipment, managing fixed ropes, and living temporarily on vertical terrain. Winter climbing offered a different appeal. Fewer parties were present on the walls. Routes that might see dozens of climbers in summer could remain empty for weeks. The absence of crowds allowed slower movement and long, uninterrupted stretches of work on the rock. For some climbers of that era, solitude itself was part of the objective. Their preparations followed common practice of the time. Food, fuel, sleeping systems, and portaledges were hauled upward in stages. Weather forecasts were limited compared with modern standards, relying largely on regional predictions rather than precise valley conditions. Storm timing remained uncertain, especially in winter when Pacific systems could intensify rapidly after crossing the mountains. Accounts suggest the team expected cold conditions but manageable weather windows. The ascent was planned as a controlled, multi-day climb rather than an emergency push. At the beginning, nothing distinguished their effort from many others attempted during Yosemite winters. The risks were understood, but they were familiar risks, shaped by experience rather than recklessness. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Yosemite had become the center of American big wall climbing. Techniques refined over previous decades had transformed the granite walls into places where climbers could remain suspended for days or weeks. Systems for hauling equipment, ascending fixed ropes, and sleeping on sheer faces were no longer experimental. They were established practice, passed informally between generations of climbers. Much of this culture formed in and around Yosemite Valley, where seasonal communities gathered near trailheads and campgrounds before beginning ascents. Climbers shared route information, weather observations, and practical knowledge earned through repetition. Experience carried more authority than written instruction. Many lessons were learned directly on the wall. Winter, however, existed outside. The normal rhythm of the climbing season. Snow-limited access roads and reduced ranger patrols. Rescue responses became slower and more complicated. Helicopter operations depended heavily on visibility and wind conditions, both unpredictable during storms moving across the Sierra. As a result, winter ascents required a greater degree of self-reliance. Equipment of the period reflected transition. Aluminum hardware had replaced much older steel gear, but insulation systems remained relatively primitive compared to modern standards. Synthetic fabrics were improving, yet moisture management during prolonged cold exposure remained difficult. Sleeping bags accumulated frost. Stoves functioned inconsistently at low temperatures. Despite these limitations, climbers continued to attempt major routes through winter months. The challenge was understood not only as technical climbing, but as sustained exposure to environment. Progress slowed, and retreat became more complicated once ropes and equipment were committed high above the ground. Within this setting, a single change in weather could alter the balance entirely. A climb that began as routine could become an extended isolation without warning. The change began gradually, without immediate alarm. Forecasts available to climbers in the early 1980s suggested an incoming winter system moving inland from the Pacific. Such storms were common during the season. Many passed through quickly, leaving fresh snow on the valley floor, while the granite walls remained climbable within a day or two. As the climbers continued upward, conditions shifted faster than expected. Temperatures dropped sharply. Wind increased along the upper sections of the route, carrying fine ice crystals that settled into cracks in equipment. Moisture froze inside ropes during the night, making morning movement slower and more deliberate. Snow began falling steadily across Yosemite Valley, accumulating far more rapidly than anticipated. Park reports later described the storm as part of a larger winter pattern that delivered heavy snowfall across the Sierra Nevada, temporarily isolating sections of the region. Roads closed. Visibility narrowed. Normal activity in the valley diminished. High. On the wall, retreat became complicated. Descending required reversing fixed lines already stiffened by ice. Anchors buried under snow were difficult to reach. Each downward movement demanded time and energy equal to continuing upward. The climbers faced a practical decision common in big wall climbing, whether to descend into worsening weather or remain secured in place and wait for conditions to stabilize. The storm intensified before either option could be completed. Snowfall turned continuous. Wind swept across exposed ledges, removing accumulated warmth from clothing and equipment. Portaledges and haul bags became coated in ice. Cooking required longer fuel use, increasing concern about supplies. Communication with the valley floor was limited. No immediate signal indicated distress, but observers below eventually noticed that the party had not descended according to expected timelines. With weather worsening and visibility nearly gone, outside assistance could not reach them. At that point, isolation was no longer temporary. The climbers were effectively confined to the wall, suspended above a valley sealed by winter conditions. Once movement became unsafe, the climbers shifted from ascent to endurance. Progress upward stopped. Attention turned instead to stabilizing their position against cold and exposure. Big wall climbing systems, designed for temporary rest, now had to function as shelter for an unknown length of time. Portaledges were secured tightly against the rock to reduce movement in the wind. Anchors were reinforced where possible, distributing weight across multiple protection points. Snow accumulating on equipment had to be cleared repeatedly to prevent additional strain. Every adjustment required working with stiffened fingers and limited dexterity. Cooking became central to survival. Stoves were used not only for food preparation, but for melting snow into drinking water. Fuel consumption increased as temperatures continued to fall. Historical accounts noted that climbers in similar winter incidents carefully calculated stove use, balancing hydration against the risk of exhausting supplies too quickly. Steam from melting snow condensed inside fabric shelters, freezing later into thin layers of frost. Sleeping systems were reorganized to conserve heat. Damp clothing was rotated when possible, though drying conditions were poor. Movement inside. Confined ledges remained restricted, forcing long periods of stillness. The granite wall absorbed daytime warmth, but released it quickly after sunset, producing sharp nighttime temperature drops. Routine developed out of necessity. Equipment checks, snow clearing, food preparation, and rope maintenance filled the limited daylight hours. Tasks prevented inactivity, which increased the risk of cold injury. Even minor organization reduced uncertainty. Below them, the valley remained largely hidden by cloud and snowfall. Sound traveled upward only occasionally, distant avalanches or shifting ice echoing across the walls. No visual confirmation of rescue efforts was possible. The climbers relied on the assumption that their absence would eventually be noticed. For the moment, survival depended entirely on maintaining order within a space no larger than a narrow ledge suspended hundreds of feet above the ground. As days passed, survival became governed less by climbing skill and more by conservation. Food supplies originally packed for a planned ascent now had to last without a clear endpoint. Rations were reduced methodically. Meals became smaller and more predictable, structured around maintaining energy rather than comfort. Historical rescue summaries indicated that climbers in winter wall incidents relied heavily on calorie-dense foods that required minimal preparation. Even so, appetite often declined in prolonged cold. Eating required deliberate effort. Without sufficient intake, physical strength would diminish quickly, making even simple movements dangerous. Water remained a constant concern. Snow had to be collected and melted several times each day. The process consumed fuel and time, forcing careful scheduling. If melting stopped, dehydration could develop despite the surrounding snow. The climbers monitored fuel closely, aware that exhaustion of stove supplies would create immediate risk. Cold discipline shaped nearly every action. Gloves were removed only briefly to handle hardware. Metal surfaces burned exposed skin through freezing contact. Carabiners and ascenders accumulated ice that had to be cleared before use. Ropes stiffened overnight and required slow manipulation each morning to prevent damage. Sleep occurred in short intervals. Wind striking the wall transmitted vibration through anchors and ledges, interrupting rest. Frost formed inside sleeping, bags from breath and perspiration gradually reducing insulation. Each morning began with the same process, shaking ice crystals from fabric, reorganizing equipment, and checking anchor systems. Time lost clear definition. Without visible sunrise or sunset through heavy cloud cover, days blended together. Progress was measured only through dwindling supplies and subtle physical fatigue. The climbers remained occupied, repeating tasks not because they advanced rescue, but because structure maintained stability. Above all, inactivity was avoided. Remaining still for too long allowed cold to settle into the body. Movement, even. Small adjustments became part of survival itself. The storm system did not pass quickly. Snowfall continued in cycles, separated by brief periods of still air that offered little improvement in visibility. From the wall, the valley remained concealed beneath layers of cloud. Distance disappeared. Orientation depended entirely on the rock immediately surrounding them. Waiting became the central condition of survival. Unlike ascent, which provided measurable progress, endurance offered no clear markers. Each day required repeating established routines while accepting that external conditions remained beyond control. The climbers conserved movement, limiting unnecessary adjustments that could waste energy or increase exposure. Observation replaced action. Changes in wind direction were noted carefully. temperature shifts were judged through subtle differences in frost formation and the behavior of equipment. When clouds thinned briefly, faint outlines of the valley appeared far below, confirming that storms had deposited significant snow accumulation. These moments were short and offered no reliable indication of when rescue might become possible. Isolation affected perception of time. Without regular sound from the valley, silence expanded. Occasionally, distant helicopter noise was imagined or briefly heard, though poor weather prevented aircraft from approaching the walls safely. Rescue operations in Yosemite during winter depended heavily on stable visibility and storms repeatedly. Grounded attempts to reach stranded climbers. Physical fatigue accumulated gradually. Hands required longer warming periods before work could begin each morning. Small tasks demanded more concentration. Fuel and food calculations were revisited daily, adjusted to account for delays that extended beyond initial expectations. Despite uncertainty, systems held. Anchors remained secure. Equipment functioned within limits. The climbers' survival depended less on dramatic action than on preventing small problems from becoming irreversible ones. Waiting, controlled and deliberate, became a form of work. Below them, the valley continued its winter transformation, while above, the wall remained unchanged, a fixed surface against which time moved slowly. By the second phase of isolation, the effects of prolonged exposure became more visible. Energy reserves declined despite careful rationing. Movements once routine required preparation. Even adjusting ropes or repositioning equipment demanded pauses for recovery. Cold reduced efficiency, extending the time needed for every task. Supplies narrowed toward minimum levels. Fuel calculations grew increasingly precise. Stove use was shortened wherever possible, limiting warm meals and reducing available drinking water. Snow melting continued, but at lower volumes. Dehydration risk increased gradually, compounded by altitude and constant cold air. Attempts to consider descent were revisited but abandoned. Ice accumulation along fixed lines made controlled lowering hazardous. Sections of rope had frozen into rigid curves, and buried anchors could not be evaluated safely. A failed descent would likely result in injury beyond the possibility of rescue during ongoing storms. Remaining in place, though difficult, remained the least dangerous option. Physical warning signs appeared. Numbness lasted longer after exposure. Minor frostnip required attention to prevent permanent injury. Sleep interruptions accumulated into persistent fatigue. Historical rescue accounts describe climbers in such conditions entering periods of slowed reaction, where decision-making required deliberate effort rather than instinct. Psychological pressure increased without outward drama. The absence of clear progress created uncertainty more taxing than immediate danger. Each day resembled the previous one. Expectations adjusted downward, focusing only on maintaining stability until weather allowed outside access. The wall offered no variation. Granite, rope, and cold remained constant. Survival narrowed to continuation, preserving strength long, enough for conditions beyond their control to change. After extended confinement, the distinction between individual days weakened further. Weather patterns blended together, and memory relied less on dates than on small changes in routine. Food portions decreased incrementally. Fuel checks occurred more frequently. Each action reflected awareness that supplies could not be replaced without outside assistance. Cloud cover muted natural light, creating long periods of gray stillness. Without clear sunrise or sunset, sleep cycles shifted. Rest came irregularly, often interrupted by cold or the need to adjust equipment. Fatigue settled into a constant background condition rather than a temporary state. Observation of the environment continued, though signs of improvement were subtle. Snowfall occasionally paused, replaced by drifting wind that cleared small sections of sky. These intervals suggested the storm system was weakening, yet conditions on the wall remained severe. Ice built up along anchor points and haul lines, requiring slow maintenance to prevent failure. Records later indicated that search awareness had begun below, though the climbers themselves could not confirm it. Sound carried unpredictably through winter air. At times, distant echoes suggested activity in the valley, but visibility never allowed verification. Uncertainty persisted. Mental focus narrowed to immediate necessities. Tasks were performed methodically, without urgency but without delay. Survival depended on avoiding mistakes caused by exhaustion. Every secured knot, every checked anchor represented continuity. Time no longer moved forward in a familiar way. It extended outward, measured only by endurance. The climbers remained suspended between storm and rescue, sustained by routine rather than expectation. As weather conditions gradually stabilized, awareness of the overdue climbing party spread. Through Yosemite Valley, rangers with the National Park Service began coordinating a response once visibility improved enough to evaluate the walls safely. Winter rescues required careful timing. Heavy snowfall had limited access routes, and aircraft could not operate reliably until winds weakened and cloud cover lifted. Initial observations confirmed that the climbers remained on the wall. From the valley floor, rescuers could see movement and intact equipment, indicating that the party had survived the storm period. Direct approach, however, remained complicated. Snow and ice conditions along the route prevented a rapid ground ascent, and helicopter operations depended on narrow windows of stable air. When flight conditions allowed, rescue teams used aerial reconnaissance to assess anchor positions and possible extraction points. Winter air currents along granite faces were unpredictable, forcing pilots to maintain distance while rescuers evaluated options. Communication was limited, relying largely on visual signals. The extraction proceeded cautiously. Rescuers were lowered in stages, securing additional lines and stabilizing the climbers before lifting operations began. Cold exposure and exhaustion were evident but manageable. The process required multiple passes, each timed around shifting wind conditions, moving through the valley. No rapid departure was possible. Every movement prioritized safety over speed. Equipment was transferred gradually, followed by the climbers themselves. Observers later described the operation as methodical rather than dramatic, shaped by the same restraint that governed survival on the wall. Once removed from the face, the climbers were transported to medical evaluation within the park. Reports indicated fatigue, cold stress, and weight loss, but no catastrophic injuries. The rescue concluded quietly, without ceremony, as winter conditions continued across the Sierra. After the rescue, winter continued in Yosemite National Park, much as it had before the incident. Snow covered the valley floor. Storm cycles moved across the mountains with little acknowledgement of what had taken place high on the granite face. Within days, physical traces of the event began to disappear beneath new weather. For rescuers and climbers alike, the incident became part of Yosemite's ongoing record of seasonal risk. No single mistake defined what had occurred. Instead, it reflected the narrow margin that exists between controlled expedition and enforced endurance when environment shifts unexpectedly. The climbers had relied on established systems, shelter, routine, and discipline, rather than dramatic measures. Historical accounts treated the rescue as evidence of both preparedness and limitation. Experience allowed survival long enough for outside help to arrive, yet experience could not prevent isolation once the storm closed the valley. Winter climbing remained possible, but never predictable. Nothing permanent marked the location. Routes were climbed again in later seasons. Equipment changed. Forecasting improved. Still, the granite remained unchanged, indifferent to human presence. The story settled into Yosemite's broader history not as a triumph, but as a quiet example of survival shaped by patience, restraint, and time, ending without spectacle, leaving only memory against stone.